All right, well, why don't we start with some introductions, and I'm going to turn here, and you can start. I think we'll have some brief introductions, and then I'm going to start asking some questions. I've been promised by this panel that they will just take off where they want to, ask their own questions, and engage with each other. So why don't we start here?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and good morning. My name is Joerg Moeller. I am head of R&D for Bayer's Pharmaceuticals division. I'm an MD by training. I'm the only non-CEO on the CEO panel. That's why I'm not wearing a tie, and look forward to the discussion.
The reason you're relaxed, okay. So I'm Kieran Murphy, the CEO of GE Healthcare. I've been in the job for about 2 years now. Prior to that, I was CEO of Life Sciences at GE Healthcare.
My name is Frans van Houten. I'm the CEO of Philips.
Yeah, my name is Bernd, Montag, CEO of Siemens Healthineers, the biggest startup in healthcare.
Okay, thank you. So I had mentioned in my early comments that one of the real challenges is how do we prioritize what we want to do. We're looking at the future, the promissory notes of AI in so many different domains, and that's all throughout healthcare. And yet, how do we pick which are the ones we want to focus on, which are the ones we want to invest on? How do we do that within the companies that we're in? So I want to start out with that question.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I see two big categories when it comes to the application of AI across the value chain of R&D in our industry. One category is what I consider efficiency drivers, and to me that's kind of homework, has to be done, but it's typically not what gives you a sustainable competitive advantage. The other category is more disruptive approaches, where with the use of AI you gain insights that with traditional means wouldn't be possible or very difficult to gain. And these are the more strategic applications. And at Bayer, we have actually applied AI across quite a number of different steps in the value chain of the R&D process. For example, when it comes to chemical synthesis and the optimization of chemical synthesis, we are using AI to optimize the way we come up with potential new innovative drug compounds by trying to optimize the synthesis in terms of picking the right chemical reaction, using and playing around with what is the optimal temperature, optimal solvent. And we have made great improvements, both in terms of productivity as well as our ability to come up with very innovative approaches there. And that is something where I would cluster in actually both categories.
So before we go on, let me ask you a question about what you just said, because this is interesting. So part of the challenge is, I think for many times when we think about these things, we think about what we're doing in many, many, many different parts of the company. And then sometimes someone will say, well, does AI have a role in this? Mm-hmm. Does AI have a role in this? So it's an interesting kind of concept, because AI is often still external. It's viewed as something that will help us do something, but it gets brought in as a concept, rather than ultimately, I think what we're thinking about is it's just so ingrained in what we do, no one needs to call out, does AI have a role in this? So how is that working now for you in these different things that you've mentioned, and what does that look like going forward?
I believe you need both. We have certain approaches that we really develop in-house, using in-house data science expertise. But then there are other areas where we have to rely on partners. And I think it has been mentioned yesterday, are also using an image pattern recognition that allows an earlier identification of patients that are affected by a special form of increased pulmonary hypertension, a deadly disease. And this application allows an earlier identification of these patients. That is something that we are doing in a collaboration with our partner Merck. But we also have, like the example I provided earlier, an in-house approach. We are also now in discussions with our great partners here at MIT on the use of AI for the identification and characterization of patients for clinical trials. And that is also where we consciously decided to enter into discussions with a partner.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as I think about GE generally, of course, we have a real mix of stuff going on, as you'd expect. You know, when I talk to my colleagues in energy or power, you know, we use AI to decide the angle for wind turbines and look at different conditions like that. We have very interesting application in the power space where, you know, we've extra layer of security to identify cyber attack so that to protect installations. And then as I think about healthcare, there's kind of two angles in my mind really. One is, you know, I always think we're in the business of improving the productivity of the ecosystem. And so we're investing, and I think that's, and I know we'll probably come to that discussion about phasing of investment, but that's a real sort of short-term return on investment effectively for ourselves and for our customers. And typically that would be through something like what we're calling the clinical command center in hospitals. And then of course there's, as you'd expect, the clinical decision support apps effectively, which we work with people like yourselves, and the sky is the limit, or would I say the pool is infinite that we could chase in terms of applications in there. So I think we're fishing in a pretty deep pond, and that's why we're investing here.
So I think to some of the points you've made, it is infinite. I mean, if you just sit back and think about it, or talk to a number of people, it just goes on and on and on. And that's, of course, as usual, the great promise, but also the great challenge. So if you're thinking about this in terms of your company, how do you do that? And also recognizing that some of this concept of return on investment, you know, you can look at in stages, but some of it is really out there. And the further away you get, the harder it is, so.
Well, I think it's been pretty well documented that we don't have infinite resources. So, but we're investing a lot here. Yeah. For both the short and the long term. I think to address just the sheer scale of potential, we're spending a lot of time and energy on platform as opposed to individual applications. We're doing that as well, but we're placing a lot of emphasis on what we call the Edison platform, so that we can attack this from several different angles and provide toolkits for people like yourselves, and we've have a link with the American College of Radiology that we spoke about over the weekend, so that we're putting the ability for radiologists and clinicians to develop their own AI, but they need a platform. It needs to have a home so that it can reside, and that's where we're trying to invest. And I think that it feels like the role of people like us actually to do work like that.
And I would just to say the obvious, one of the challenges I think we have in healthcare systems is there are so many to choose from. So we are confronted with many companies who are developing many platforms. And then the question is, how do you choose the right one? And is that even a correct concept? What does that actually mean, the right one? The right one for what? So I think those are the challenges, again, we need to work on together. And let me just turn to our next comment.
Right. Well, at Philips, we have taken the health continuum as our scope. And when you look at the challenges that health and healthcare society is facing, then the burden of that definitely means that we need to strive for better outcomes and higher efficiency. And so efficiency and outcomes need to go together. And data plays a huge role in that. The whole digitization of the healthcare ecosystem plays a big role in that. Now, humans are not always the best suited to handle large amounts of data. In fact, we are not always the best to do repetitive work. So in our innovation strategy, we have embraced what we would call a healthcare architecture that goes across the continuum of care, where we look at how patient journeys are designed, how workflows are designed, how the different care providers and actors play in that ecosystem, and how you then support them to become more productive, and how data can be contextual, made available in order to get to the right decisions, get to the most efficient workflows, avoid mistakes, enhance the experience, avoid stress. So the quadruple aim can be truly supported using data if you do it in the right way. I had a hospital CEO in Canada tell me, you know, before EMR I didn't have data, and now I drown in the data, so thank you very much for having an EMR. Right? So apparently just having a repository of data is not good enough, so we need to make it specific and actionable, and by having this architecture we can make data interoperable, we can make them, and through AI we can bring them to the fore in the best way possible. I'd like to emphasize that we have stopped talking at Philips about AI as artificial intelligence, but we prefer to call it adaptive intelligence. Adaptive because it needs to adapt to you. Right? And we are a little bit at the top of the hype curve when it comes to AI. And, but for AI to be usefully adopted, it needs to be adaptive and integrated in the workflow, supportive to the people, supportive to the patients. And then it can do great things. It can enhance quality and it will enhance productivity. So for us, it's a big bet. We invest 1.8 billion euro in R&D annually. I wish it was all well spent. I don't know, actually. Maybe AI can tell us that. But I can say that now 1 in 2 R&D people is in software, and we have literally 600 plus data scientists. So it is moving rapidly.
Yeah, and that is that sort of return on investment promissory note in the future that I think we're all balancing out here.
Well, but the good thing about informatics and also AI is that the cycles of innovation go faster than in hardware. Yep. And you still have, by the way, the option to embed AI also in the machines. So it is not that, you know, now we only have these software layers and the machines are no longer important. That's not true. Embedding AI in ultrasound or in scanners and so on is also very useful. But once you adopt a more layered architecture, our experience is that the time to market of new innovations can actually come down. And I think that is exciting. So it is not all futuristic stuff at all.
Terrific, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as Siemens Healthineers, I mean, we are in a, actually, I think, lucky position as a very strong player in imaging, because imaging is at the core of the digital transformation of healthcare, simply because it is generating digital assets here. And what we see, what is going on in radiology is what will replicate later in other specialties. So our approach to your question of focus on productivity or on disruptive things is actually we have a very clear roadmap to start with automating the products, more on a product level with embedded AI, so to make the products more intelligent. Then in a next step, help with our so-called companions to read images. So it's the better diagnosis. Then in a next step, to guide through a clinical pathway to then end up in the vision of a digital twin of the patient, where you have one comprehensive digital model and apply AI to the virtual human being or virtual patient, so to say. And on that journey, I mean, we have there's in the first stages, we are actually to some extent doing things with AI or enabling things with AI which before have been done by humans. Yeah? And at some point, there's this transition where AI does things which cannot be done by humans. Mm-hmm. And I think what we all need to be aware of, that at that point, it is also very important. It's not just a technology question, it is also an adoption question. Yeah? Because it changes how people look at their own roles. It elevates the role of physicians to something different. Yeah? It changes our role from an imaging and diagnosis company to a decision company, and so on and so on. So then it is not just a technological challenge. Yeah?
Well, it's a terrific point, and it also relates to one of the points that Ash Carter made earlier today about how there has to be a human somewhere at the end of the responsibility chain. But it also speaks to the larger issue of how do people fit into this and what is their role.
I think what we need to be aware of is that it's not just AI adjusting to what we have been used to be doing, it is us, the whole ecosystem of players adjusting to the new possibilities and looking in new ways to us. And I call it not changed, it's in an elevated way, because we can more look from above on what is happening in the system now.
Absolutely, yes. You wanted to comment?
Maybe a comment on your question, what is the right platform? Is there a right platform? Just as an example, I had the opportunity to participate in a meeting of the R&D heads of the 20 largest pharma companies over the weekend. We also had senior officials from the main regulatory agencies with us, and we were discussing, doesn't it make sense in this day and age to think about the creation of a cloud-based platform where we upload clinical data and where also regulators have access? Because in the absence of such a platform, it is likely that each company would do this on their own. And I think that, to me, is a very convincing example where a platform could be created where value creation would occur basically for all participants. But that hasn't to be the case for each and every situation. But I think that's a very plausible example from my perspective.
Well, and it kind of gets into the next question of partnerships in general, and how does that work? And I would say for a healthcare system to build everything ourselves obviously doesn't make any sense. The challenges of who you partner to build what with, and what is it that you're building that could potentially, for lack of a better term, have a life of its own out there, is the challenge. But how do you view these partnerships, given the number of companies out there and the number of things that are going on? And that could include nonprofits, but specifically other companies. Yeah.
Well, in this time, and you can see the interest in the topic of AI, I predict we first will go through a proliferation with more players coming into the field rather than fewer. And that re-emphasizes this need for a platform approach, because I think hospitals will be inundated with all these gimmicks, all these nice apps that say are, point solutions that can do something. Yep. But the CIO of the provider will go crazy if you need to accommodate all these point solutions. And moreover, how do you assure that the totality of all those point solutions still yield a great productivity and result? So I'm completely with the notion that you need to adopt platforms. Mm-hmm. Now, platforms can be open, and I think the right platform is an open platform.
That's right.
Right? Because then you have ability to adapt various AI apps on top of that platform, while assuring quality and compliance of your overall house and the care ecosystem that you need to operate in. And that brings me to the question around partnerships. We can provide you with a platform, but maybe not with all the hundreds of point solutions that can fit on that platform. I think we need platforms where people can collaborate. For me, a platform is not to be confused with a data cloud, because data cloud is something completely different. We can talk about that too. But having a clinical and operational platform, I think, will create an environment where this can all work. And then we can, in fact, you should then determine which applications you want to choose.
Kieran.
So I completely agree with the points that Frans made. I guess what you step back and say what's going to be needed to really make AI trusted, useful, robust. It will be high volumes of data, well curated and diverse. And when you think about that, that's where I think the partnerships really evolve, because you need volume, and so we're doing a lot of partnerships around the world, but through that we get more volume. I think we get the diversity of data sets, and that's critical, because then you get true veracity. Yeah. And I think, and obviously, part of what Frans is saying, I think, is that part of this is really deciding who does what. And, I do see hospital systems saying to me, we're going to build a platform, and I'm tempted to say, well, why are you doing that? That's our job. What I'd really like you to focus on curating data, and really, for any of us who have a platform, make that platform more robust, and then we win the trust. I think we win the trust of clinicians, and we win the trust of patients, and I think that's so. These partnerships, they're fundamental, because frankly, there's no one player in the system that can do this by themselves. And again, we well documented. We do things with you, and we do things with UCSF and NVIDIA, because we all have a role to play here.
So I think that's a critical point in terms of how we need these partnerships. Sometimes we're blessed in a sense with inventors within our own healthcare system who are already starting to do things. And one could say, I wish there were a company out there who are already doing this, And sometimes there is, and we don't know about it, and sometimes it's just going to take time. So I think part of it is also the time pressure of how rapidly you want to accelerate things and how quickly things are available for partnering. And that, of course, gets into the area of co-development. And how do we do that?
But your researchers do great work. And I think they all want translational research that gets to clinical practice at scale.
Yes.
Now, that's the crux. You cannot do that as a researcher. You need to qualify your research know-how, package it as an app on a platform, and then through a marketplace get that to other clinical institutions. This is why Philips, we work with Dana-Farber to package their cancer pathway knowledge into, let's say, apps that can democratize then cancer care and provide a return path with financial benefits to the researchers. And I think that is then an ecosystem where we can all flourish. And
absolutely, for the investigator, for the inventor, absolutely perfect. For the clinician with an idea, absolutely what we want to do. And sometimes also, to your point, and beyond that, the challenge is how do you pick those things that you want to invest in at that local level so it could get to a point where it then can be scaled or has the potential of scaling.
Maybe as a comment, the question is, what is so fundamentally new about it? Yeah, because from our experience, just as an example, we have about 4,000 clinical or research collaborations worldwide. Yeah, and traditionally, it's like somebody has a new MR sequence, somebody has a new way of imaging the prostate, and so on and so on, and then we had an analog way of translating this into an application. Turned it into a product, and as Frans put it, democratized it. Yeah? What is now possible is basically to automate that process. Yeah, but the idea that more or less every innovation we have, as probably all the companies we are here, are the result of that communication and exchange between technology and medicine, yeah, which makes medtech so exciting. And now it is about, quote unquote, automating. It's an engineering approach, an automated approach to doing this, but I think it's from a mechanic point of view, not fundamentally new.
So we have a number of questions from the audience, so I'm going to start with this one. New technology is great, but how much forethought have you given to designing the systems around the person, i.e. human-centered design, to avoid the pitfalls of documented burnout as seen with electronic medical records?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I would say we have 100 apps, I think, live right now on the platform, and a lot of that is directed towards improved workflow. And improved workflow does focus on you know, whether it's a radiologist or a clinician, to simplify their lives. And just one example would be we have an app that adapts to the style by which the radiologist works and hangs the image in a specific way in the system. And you know, I think that's just an example, because Frans mentioned stress earlier. I mean, I think this is a fundamental role that AI and ourselves can play here, is to ensure that clinicians spend more time with the patient rather than trying to figure out, you know, what does the data, what does this image mean?
But you need to have an innovation philosophy around it. And we have embraced design thinking as a way to take the voice of all the users in, and also to use design thinking as co-create method, where you can work with various clinicians to get their insights, but also you start the change program through that as well, because then the adoption of the technology becomes a lot easier.
I like that point a lot, and I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little more about how that actually works in the company. What does that look like in the company? With the people, with the programs, what does it look like?
Well, so for us, design is a dedicated resource that is different from software coding or hardware design. And we have sociologists, we have clinical practitioners, doctors, nurses in these design teams. And we go actively out there to co-create in the clinical practice or in the research institution to design what the experience needs to be. So that technology is actually useful and not a burden on the staff. And let's face it, often it is. Right? And that can be avoided with a good design process.
And maybe as one thought, I mean,
please,
because of this physician burnout debate, I think one extreme case or the ideal case of AI is that you don't even realize it. Yeah, so that it's not, there is no workflow, there is no user interface. It's just happening. Yeah, and you know, in one of our products, you know, a chest reading app. Yeah, it's, I mean, the only interface which is there, accept, reject. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and I think this is an illustration for how much it is really helping to make the life of physicians easier, while, you know, having the ultimate last moment of control.
Mm-hmm. I think from an R&D process, getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time is certainly one of the imperatives that drives us. And I think with omics technologies, big data, and deep analytics, we are making great strides towards that. That ultimately means an individualization of treatment. If you approach it from the other angle, and yesterday we had a panel discussion on real-world evidence, you can sometimes reach certain boundaries there, because real-world evidence is generated in specific healthcare systems. And if you basically look at the US healthcare system, we typically have patients frequently changing their healthcare providers, and that limits longitudinal data availability. So I think we, of course, try to approach it from all sorts of different angles, but we also have to acknowledge that we live in a certain environment that sets certain limitations, also when it comes to trying to really make individual treatment decisions.
So a question about R&D and cost savings around it. So the specific question is, one would expect that using AI in either drug R&D or whatever R&D the company is doing, there will be cost savings. And so the question is, will they be passed down to the consumer, and how are we thinking about that?
It's definitely one for you, Joerg.
Thank you. I mean, as I said earlier, I think one of the great promises that we already seen being delivered is efficiency drivers. And we just announced yesterday that Bayer will be building a stronger presence right here at the Kendall Square area in Cambridge. This decision is the result of us becoming more efficient in R&D, because clearly the mandate I got was you have a certain budget frame. Bayer spent last year more than $3 billion in pharmaceuticals R&D, and my CEO isn't getting me more resources, so we need to look at becoming more efficient with the resources we have. I think going forward, the really critical piece is effect size of innovations. And I think AI also can play a very critical role in that. Because I believe that the days of incremental innovation will become more difficult, because they're simply not really affordable for healthcare systems any longer. But really, as we approach also potentially curative approaches in debilitating, very hard to treat disease states, from an healthcare cost containment perspective, I think that is a very important contribution, and that's clearly one of the focus areas of R&D.
But the simple answer is, yes, it will make it cheaper. I mean, we all have these things in our pockets, right? That would fill a room not only 15 years ago in terms of compute power. Philips actually sells an ultrasound probe that you can connect to your smartphone. Yeah. And you have an ultrasound machine right at the point of care for a fraction of the cost that it used to cost. And then through AI, we can actually compensate for an inexperienced sonographer by reconstructing multiple probe acquisition of data acquisitions, building a holistic 3D image of a breast. And then through AI, we can detect a lesion. And then through the cloud, we can provide telehealth to support people to interpret these images. I mean, all of this makes healthcare accessible, more affordable. But it does require, to get to the full benefit, the system also will have to change. Yeah. And that, I think, applies also back to this room, that the system in way we engage with patients and deliver care will have to shift. And, you know, we are pretty strong in interventional cardiology and peripheral vascular cardiology. If I look, most peripheral vascular interventions are now done in office-based labs. These cost less, right? And it's just a better care setting to do things. And so for some of the benefits to come to full fruition, we together will have to redesign how the care system is designed and how we deliver care. And then the benefits, cost and outcomes will come.
And I think, you know, I agree with you. And you also made the point about longitudinal data and the impact. So if you think about integrated data sets and how systems will learn over time, you know, we've never probably made full use of the data that's in the medical records. We've never made full use of the data that exists in images. The same applies to pathology or in vitro tests. But I think where this is headed, like, which is really exciting, is you start to integrate, you know, And I think that's where we have to all work long term. You start to integrate these data sets and use AI to provide that linkage. It completely changes, I think, the cost for patient, the safety for patients, and I think the productivity of the entire system changes for all sorts of reasons.
Well, you know, it's interesting because it does get back to these same issues of collaboration, partnership. What does that look like? And, you know, of course, for academic medical centers, partnering through grants, through many different collaborations with many different academic medical centers, and often, you know, throughout the country and even globally, is kind of part of what you do as a researcher. So I think one of the questions, and this has come up now in a number of questions from the audience, is we understand the partnerships and the nonprofits. We understand we're starting to understand, or understanding more about partnerships between healthcare systems and companies. But I think the question is, what do those partnerships between companies look like? And where does that go? So one specific question here is, I'll give you two, actually. GE, Philips, and Siemens hold 80% of the imaging market. What are those three companies doing collaboratively to help the community move forward in thinking about platforms and these other infrastructures? So there you go. Well, we're all here now. We can start thinking, yeah?
Well, we sit here.
But I think, look, we are developing partnerships. I mean, the reality is, I don't think anybody would thank all three of us for coming up with one platform that's going to apply to the whole world. I'm not sure that would exactly be a globally accepted solution somehow. But I think, you know, it comes to a point that we made before, which is, I think it is our responsibility to put together a platform, and that those platforms have to have several layers. They have to be, you know, protect the patient's data for a start, be cyber secure, and if we need to work very well with the ecosystem. Look, we are competitors, but I think that there is room for a robust set of platforms out there. And I think the way we're all going about it actually is pretty responsible, and it's at the right level.
We work with all three of them.
There you go.
Yeah.
But I think in all seriousness, it is a difficult area. It is something where there are models that go on, and it's just a challenge going forward. And I think one that we just have to acknowledge will be a challenge going forward. But there are things, and you've already alluded to some things that I know all of you are doing with other companies that could be harnessed in a collaborative way.
Routinely, you know, we work with many companies.
Absolutely.
And, you point now out to, actually, as the Chinese call it, GPS. In that order, that's how we are often referred to. But there are many more health technology companies and pharma companies in the world, and we need collaboration, full stop, right? Yeah. Because this is too big, and you as a provider don't want to have isolated, insulated ivory tower solutions.
And I think it comes also back to the point of how we win trust. The one thing we don't want is to end up with pinpoint solutions that have a lot of bias in the system, and that somehow, you know, gets the whole thing a bad name. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, maybe it's a theoretical question, because I mean, I don't know whether there's a concrete concern, because I think, you know, in the last years, I mean, in many instances, it was very, I mean, here's contrast injectors which work with each system. Here's a PEX which works across vendors. Here is the DICOM standard. Here is the workstation and whatever. And I think what we have all learned is that trying to force a proprietary solution, you don't win with it. So the openness is extremely important, and it's a lesson we have all learned. And I also don't believe that this will change.
So this is less a question than a comment, and if someone wants to comment on this, that would be great. But it basically says, open platforms to build AI efficiencies, understand that. But the reality is, given that there are a small number of private companies which hold the key to most healthcare organizations, when it really comes to EHR vendors, how do you then think about what other companies or what others can bring to this? How do you see that coming to fruition? And again, it's less a question than a comment, but if anyone has a comment.
EHR companies also have to commit to being open, and they don't always do that.
Yeah.
Right? And I would go as far as that we need to make APIs available. Through our IntelliSpace discovery platform, we work with 50 academic hospitals who all develop apps on top of our platform. That's an open API. And I foresee something similar to a consumer platform like an iPhone or a Google phone, is where you can develop your apps on multiple platforms. They are portable, right? If you have good design rigor in how you design the application. That then also avoids the lock-in, but it does presume, back to the data trust and the data lake, is that everybody creates openness and access to the data probably in a federated method rather than in a single instance of data, because I think that's unachievable. But if through federated data architectures you can access data, and the EMR companies will have to abide by that. Mm-hmm. And I think users like you need to tell them that.
Mm-hmm. We do. Often. Okay, so let me move on to people. There are a number of questions here that actually relate to people. Some of it deals with how are we training students across the board in thinking about this area. What does that look like at a college level or even a high school level? So that's sort of one set of questions, which is really what is the pipeline for talent that you're seeing out there? And I guess the related question is, how do you look at these individuals in your companies in terms of recruitment, retention, given the importance of this to what we're all doing? You want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a while that I attended university, but clearly access to talent and also have talent that brings in new capabilities is critical to what we are doing. And in particular, for example, when it comes to data scientists, which are in great demand, and basically it means I am in competition with a company like Amazon for the same skill set, which is different from maybe where it was 10, 15 years ago. And it also means that we need to be able to bring this new skill set into contact and collaboration with traditional skills that will still remain a domain expert topic. And one key success criteria will be how we can create an environment and also a setup that allows cross-fertilization and ideally those disciplines working together. And what we are doing in R&D at Bayer is we have set up a digital technology function which tries to combine the data scientific skill sets, but the business relevant questions are still driven by the respective functions and not driven out of this DT function.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, so we have made several shifts in our policies, anticipating the need for more, sophisticated software data scientists. Some of these changes are to move away out of the province back into urban areas. We are building a 2,000 people center here in Cambridge. But similarly, we moved into downtown Pittsburgh, in Paris, in Amsterdam, because you need to be where the talent wants to live. Secondly, some of our traditional product creation processes don't apply. Right? We should not burden people with that. And the data scientist, I mean, I guess it applies to everybody, but for this group, is very mobile, and they will only come and work for you if they respect the boss. If they don't respect the boss, the pay doesn't help, right? So it makes us much more critical as to, what is the ecosystem in which people need to work.
And I think some of this comes, I was very encouraged recently. I mean, we were in a battle to recruit a senior data scientist from, one of the FANG companies. And I think when people like ourselves talk through the purpose we have, we're in an ecosystem striving for precision health. Do you want to do that, or do you want to write apps for social media? That's the big attraction. Yeah. People know that they come to a healthcare company like us, and it is going to make a huge difference. And I completely agree with the other point, which is, I think just the diversity that we're chasing by having people in different centers around the world, as we look for this sort of variety in data, I think people understand that they can be part of something that's truly global, but at a local level, they have a real role to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, and I think what we also need to bear in mind, I mean, that like everybody over the years, people transform into some kind of a mix, because, I mean, in the beginning, you define yourself as a data scientist, but then over time, I mean, people get the medical context and so on, and the purpose, which Kieran talked about, which is really attractive, is also, somehow giving the people a new identity. So they don't look at themselves as data scientists anymore. They are part of advancing healthcare.
Yeah, and that actually, I think, is just one of the singularly most important points, is how does it become part of the fabric of the organization in terms of what we do in the future. So we only have a few minutes left, so I want to just go around with one last question, which is, what do you think is the most challenging or the biggest barrier for accelerated adoption of AI, and how do we, or you, or any of us collectively, think about that? So now we're in the other end of the spectrum, which is really the adoption. Do you want to start?
So look, I just think it's back to this, the getting true data at source, and having that, because, I had other people on other panels talk about this during the meeting. By its very nature, we live in a very fragmented ecosystem. How do you ensure that we're getting, data that's well curated, and you are somehow able to aggregate that sufficiently so that you have robustness and lack of bias? I think that's this is a key challenge.
Yep. So I would, just to say something different so that we don't look aligned here. Because we compete,
Go for it.
No, I think the biggest barrier is in all of our heads. Yeah, I mean, we have to really think new, and redefine ourselves. Yeah, I mean, there is the big discussion. What has been the big discussion about, what does it mean for radiology, for example. And I think the more people reinvent themselves and say, I am a technology adopter, I am an information broker, as opposed to I am the guy looking at images, Or, when we look at us, we are great at building these machines, and big MRs and so on, as opposed to we are the decision-making company, This is the real topic. I think it's not so much in technology and regulatory and so on. It's really, I mean, how do we all adapt to it? Yeah.
So the preparedness to change is, I think, the key to success for AI. And the other point I want to reiterate is that there will be a lot of false claims being made and that may harm the reputation of something that is fundamentally good. Right? So, and I think we all own that collectively to make sure that we have high standards.
I think from my perspective, I agree with what has been said. The closer we get to healthcare delivery, I think actually it is the healthcare systems and their political environment within which they operate, which can put limitations. Because I mean, a creatinine value is a data point, but the value of that data point is different in different healthcare systems.
Yeah, and again, I think how we view ourselves as people, leaders, institutions, healthcare systems, a lot of that will be the proactive redefinition, if you will, in terms of thinking of the future. But the other is just the concrete things that happen every day, and that will help redefine ourselves, just as radiologists or pathologists, et cetera, are starting to, in their disciplines, rethink what it is and who they are. That just scales up to, I think, an entire organization. And again, a lot of it depends on what people will actually see as moving forward in a positive way and actually changing the way things work. Because unless you see that, I think for many it's harder to define. Any last comments? Close on that note?
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right, very good.